St. McDermott. And in this video, we're going to take a look at two campaigns during the early days of the Civil War that occurred in what was referred to at the time as the Western Division. And that simply meant that geography south of the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi. There were several actions that took place west of the Mississippi, but they were relatively small and they did not have a significant impact on the outcome of the Civil War. However, the two campaigns we're going to discuss today were significant. And in both cases, we find General U.S. Grant deeply involved. The war in the West was initially marked by 6 months of localized fighting and political maneuvering, and while Missouri and Kentucky were held in the Union, Tennessee succeeded and joined the Confederacy. The rebels quickly built forts on the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers to block the Federals from using those rivers as avenues into the South from the Ohio River. And on 1 February 1862, General Henry Halleck, headquartered at St. Louis and commanding the Department of the Missouri, ordered General Ulysses Grant to move up the Tennessee River and capture Fort Henry. General Grant began his advance the very next day, and working in concert with Commodore Andrew Foote's fleet of transports and gunboats, organized as the Western Gunboat Flotilla, General Grant was in position to launch his attack on 6 February. So this is not a man who sat around. He received the order on the 1st, he moved on the 2nd, and 4 days later, he's ready to initiate the attack. The fort was poorly sited on low ground and due to heavy rains had become partially flooded by the rising river. The Confederate commander, realizing his vulnerability, ordered his 2,500-man garrison to withdraw and marched the 11 miles to Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. However, a 50-man artillery company remained at Fort Henry to operate the guns that were still above water. The Federal troops had been put ashore out of range of the fort's cannon and were struggling through flooded swamps and timber to approach the fort, while Commodore Foote's gunboats moved ahead and opened an accurate and destructive bombardment of the fort at near point-blank range. After 2 hours of heavy punishing fire, the Confederates were forced to surrender, although several of the gunboats were also badly damaged. General Grant was impatient to press on and attack Fort Donelson, but continued heavy rain and primitive roads slowed the artillery and supply wagons. 3 gunboats were detached to continue upstream from Fort Henry to destroy an important railroad bridge, and the rest were able to regain the Ohio River and then steam up the Cumberland River to support General Grant's troops when they began to arrive before Fort Donelson on the 12th of February. Commodore Foote attempted to repeat his Fort Henry success, but Fort Donelson, located on a commanding height, presented a much more difficult objective. Well-sighted cannon pounded the gunboats, causing serious damage and forcing them to withdraw out of range. General Grant's 27,500 soldiers established positions resembling a horseshoe, holding the 17,500 Confederate soldiers against the river in their fort. While the weather had been wet and miserable, it now turned bitterly cold, with blowing snow and a nighttime temperature of 12 degrees Fahrenheit. General John Floyd, the Confederate commander, did not think he could hold the fort and planned an attack to break the Union flank so his force could withdraw to Nashville. The attack was successful, and after several hours of hard fighting, the Confederates had opened a wide door. But then the Confederate commander hesitated. General Floyd vacillated, and after several hasty conferences with his subordinate commanders, he ordered the troops who had successfully pushed back the Union line to abandon that and return to their positions in the fort, in Fort Cumberland. General Grant was not present to influence that action because earlier that morning, Commodore Foote, who had been wounded the previous day, asked him to come aboard the flagship for a conference. Only after returning to his headquarters did General Grant learn his right flank had been under serious attack, and he immediately sent a message to the Commodore requesting a show of force on the river while riding to the scene of the fight. Without the least show of excitement, General Grant shifted troops and ordered the lost positions to be retaken, regaining the initiative that the Confederates had relinquished. By nightfall, Federal troops had again totally invested Fort Donelson, with the exception of a flooded trail along the river. After another council of war, Confederate General Floyd decided to surrender the fort, but he feared personal reprisal, as he had previously been the Secretary of War and was under a federal indictment for delivering arms and ammunition to Southern arsenals before hostilities broke out. Taking his staff and several other officers, he escaped by boat that night, and Confederate General Johnson Pillow also escaped with part of his brigade by commandeering a riverboat, leaving General Simon Buckner in command. Confederate Colonel Forrest also refused to surrender, and he led his cavalry along the river using that trail that had not been interdicted by the Union troops. General Buckner asked for terms the morning of 16 February and was surprised and deeply offended when he learned unconditional surrender was his only option. General Grant's full message to General Buckner, an acquaintance of long standing in the old army, read, "Sir, yours of this date proposing armistice and appointment of commissioners to settle terms of capitulation has just been received. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works." So wrote General U.S. Grant. The U.S. soon became transcribed into Unconditional Surrender Grant. 11,500 men and 40 cannon were surrendered, and General Grant succeeded in giving the Union its first military victory of the Civil War. Union troops marched into Nashville a week later. No one should have been surprised by General Grant's attitude toward the rebellion. His thoughts were clearly outlined in several letters that he wrote soon after Fort Sumter had surrendered, and he wrote, "Now all party distinctions should be lost sight of, and every true patriot be for maintaining the integrity of our glorious old stars and stripes, the Constitution and the Union. We are now in the midst of trying times when everyone must be for or against his country and show his colors by his every act. I have but one sentiment. That is, we have a government and laws and a flag, and they must all be sustained. There are but two parties now, traitors and patriots." The surrender of Fort Donelson resulted in widespread mixing of the troops, Confederate and Federal. And once the shooting stopped, control was so lax that a number of rebels simply walked unchallenged through Federal lines and disappeared into the woods. One who slipped away, a man named Bushrod Johnson, later said, "I have not learned that a single Confederate who attempted to escape met with any obstacle." And thus closed the campaigns of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, opening up navigable river avenues of approach into the South. Following the surrender of Fort Donelson, General Henry Halleck, the department commander, became increasingly dissatisfied with the lack of reporting that he was receiving from the field. For more than a week, General Grant and his 27,000 men had been out of contact. What General Halleck did receive were suspicions and rumors of questionable behavior, and following consultations with Washington, he relieved General Grant of command pending an investigation. It turned out that a Union telegraph operator had deserted, taking the telegrams with him. And while that did not fully placate the department commander, General Grant was put back in command in order to rejoin his troops. General Grant's Army of the Tennessee had been increased to roughly 50,000 men by early April, just before the Battle of Shiloh. 5 divisions were encamped on the west bank of the Tennessee River at a place called Pittsburgh Landing, where the ground was boxed in by streams and was brush and timber covered with isolated open areas in the forest. The troops were in bivouacs wherever clearings were available, and drill was the order of the day because of the low level of individual training that those soldiers had received. Intelligence concerning the enemy was scanty, and security was abysmal. No cavalry screen, very few infantry pickets had been put out, and no prepared defensive positions had been dug. A 6th division commanded by General Lew Wallace was located 5 miles downstream at a place called Crump's Landing. General Grant had established his headquarters 9 miles downstream from Pittsburgh Landing at a place called Savannah, separating him from his command, although he visited daily by steamboat. He later explained he stayed at Savannah to join General Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio, which had been ordered from Nashville to join him at that place. General Halleck, still in his headquarters at St. Louis, intended to combine the 2 armies and take personal command for an attack on Corinth, Mississippi, which was a Confederate rail and logistics hub 20 miles farther south from Pittsburgh Landing. The department commander's plans were about to be put on hold by Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston and his 40,000 soldiers, who had moved into position just 2 miles from the encamped Federals at Pittsburgh Landing. Deployed for battle and straddling the Corinth Road, the Confederates attacked at first light on Sunday, the 6th of April, and they achieved immediate success by overrunning several Union camps. Surprised men were killed in their tents and on the company streets before they could respond. Disorganized and shocked Union troops were pushed almost 2 miles toward Pittsburgh Landing before a credible defense began to take shape. Thousands of Union soldiers panicked and abandoned their weapons to cower under the bluffs along the Tennessee River, although the majority of the troops stayed with their colors, retained their unit's integrity, and delivered a volume of fire that stalled the rebel assault. The fighting was confusing and often at close quarters, and casualties were heavy on both sides. 2 hours into the battle, General Grant arrived to find that a Union catastrophe was fast developing. He immediately established a straggler line to slow the flood of skulkers and sent a message back downriver to General Wallace at Crump's Landing, ordering his division to join the fight. General Buell's divisions had begun to arrive at Savannah from Nashville, and they were also ordered to immediately march to Pittsburgh Landing. After talking to several division commanders, General Grant located a regiment defending a peach orchard and a sunken road. Ordered to hold, they did so against repeated assaults while the position, afterwards labeled the Hornet's Nest, was surrounded. The Confederates assembled over 50 cannon to blast the defenders, and the Confederate commander, General Johnson, who had led the troops up from Corinth, was mortally wounded, leading an attack. Confederate General Beauregard took command, and late in the day, the 2,200 Union survivors of the Hornet's Nest, after 7 hours of furious fighting and without the possibility of reinforcement or resupply, were forced to surrender. Their bravery helped provide time for other units, however, who established and defended new positions closer to the river. Fragments of regiments were pulled together to continue the fight, as the reserves of both sides had been committed. Although the defenders' cohesion was initially lost in the confusion, the Confederates had been unable to gain a decisive battlefield victory. General Wallace's divisions began to arrive as the fighting died down, and two of General Buell's divisions also joined that night in a driving rain to bring 25,000 fresh troops into the Union lines. General Grant ordered an assault at first light on the 7th of April, and by mid-morning, Union troops were advancing all across the front. Resisting stubbornly, the Confederates were pressed back throughout the day, and by nightfall, General Beauregard achieved a well-disciplined withdrawal and had his army on the road back to Corinth. There was no effective Union pursuit, as the troops were satisfied to simply survive the experience and regain their camps. Union casualties totaled over 13,000, and the Confederates lost 10,700 men. The dead at Shiloh totaled more than all the American soldiers killed during the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Mexican War combined. And the Battle of Shiloh was a shock, not only to the participants, but also to the populations of both North and South, who were surprised and who were very upset concerning the number of fatalities that took place over a 2-day period at Shiloh. A soldier in Union General Sherman's division, a man named Jesse Young, later recalled that early on the morning of the 6th of April, quote, neighboring infantry regiments showed tokens of alarm, and some of them began to form a line of battle. An officer said the rebels must be attacking our outposts. The word was scarcely spoken when a squad of men came running by in great excitement. They shouted the news that the Confederates were making an attack, and following pell-mell behind them came the whole regiment of infantry, all very much frightened and running in dismay. A Union private named W.W. Worthington also wrote his father an account of his experience when his unit went into action on the second day. And he wrote, we were ordered to lie close to the ground. Immediately, we were exposed to a cannonade and heavy fire musketry, whose severity defies description. The foe was concealed in the thick woods so that we could not see them, but now they emerged from their cover. Our men, restrained by the officers, had not yet discharged their rifles up to this time. But now each soldier coolly marked his target, and when Captain Swain gave the command to fire, our Springfield rifles dealt a destruction that was awful. General Grant later remembered the casualties at Shiloh, and he wrote, I saw an open field in our possession on the second day, over which the Confederates had made repeated charges the first day, so covered with dead that it would have been possible to walk across the clearing in any direction, stepping only on dead bodies, without ever touching a foot to the ground. And so ended the Battle of Shiloh. Please contribute by making comments concerning these early actions of the Civil War, and I look forward to entering into a conversation. Until the next video, when we look at the next two campaigns, all the best, and God bless America.